were going to get their information. Those of us who followed events over the years in Iraq and Afghanistan through the work of unembedded independent journalists like Dar Jamail and Jeremy Scahill and others, we're also in a privileged group, as we are if we're getting the regular questioning of this endless occupation of Afghanistan through Brave New Films, Brave New Foundation, as we are privileged if we're getting news day after day from independent sites like Fire Dog Lake or Truth Dig or Truth Out or Alternet or Common Dreams or name your 5 or 10 favorites. So as I turn the floor over immediately to the panel, and I'll introduce each person just right before they speak, and then I open it up to the whole room and you can start filling out the questions. What I want people to be talking about is how can we bring independent journalism and independent media to more people, bigger audiences, bigger communities, bigger constituencies, and also the fundamental question of how independent media and independent journalists can collaborate better to improve our quality, the immediacy of our content. We know collaboration is happening thanks to important groups like the Media Consortium and New America Media. So I want to go right now to the panel. Our first panelist was born in Cairo, Egypt, and it was hard sometimes to keep a dry eye listening to his Democracy Now! Reporting from liberated Tahrir Square, reporting that was both emotional and analytical. I'm speaking, of course, of Sharif Abdel Kouddous. He joined Democracy Now!'s staff in 2003. He's covered crises from Hurricane Katrina to Haiti. In 2008, he was arrested at the Republican convention and briefly charged with a felony. He's now a senior producer and occasional host of Democracy Now! Let's hear it for Sharif.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for clapping for me being arrested. So we're supposed to speak today about how independent media covers international crises. But I think to begin, I would be remiss if I didn't mention what happened in Tahrir last night, just a few hours ago, in fact. On Friday, there was the biggest protest in Tahrir since Hosni Mubarak stepped down on February 11th. Tens of thousands of Egyptians from all walks of life filled Tahrir again. And they're calling for a number of things, but essentially for the ruling military generals that are controlling Egypt right now to honor the demands of the revolution. The two principal demands right now are for the prosecution of Hosni Mubarak, who is sitting on the beach in Sharm el-Sheikh relaxing. And another one is for some sort of civilian transitional council to be appointed to oversee these ruling generals who nobody chose to rule the country. So last night, they filled Tahrir. The army issued an order for no military officers to join them. Very strict order, under penalty of jail. A few dozen military officers disobeyed those orders and joined the protesters. They rallied, they chanted, as so many of you saw for those 18 days. They did that last night. And then a couple of thousand of them decided to spend the night and stay. And they were encouraged by these officers. And they set up tents, and these 2,000 people decided to stay to protect the officers. At about 3:20 a.m., there's a curfew now in Egypt every day from 2 to 5 a.m. At about 3:20, about a few thousand Egyptian special forces, military police, central state security forces, they came in with tanks and armored vehicles, and they stormed the square. They fired live ammunition for about 40 minutes. Most of it was in the air to try and scare people, but they fired at buildings as well. At least 2 people are dead. Many hundreds are wounded. And I think it's important to remember that while there was wall-to-wall coverage of this uprising on shows like Democracy Now! and Jazeera English, but also on the mainstream TV networks in this country, that this revolution is unfinished, the struggle is ongoing, and as American media outlets turn their focus elsewhere and continue to do this kind of parachute journalism where they just jump in to different crises and then forget about the story, independent media, that's its strength, is that it continues to follow the story through. And we'll continue to follow what's happening in Egypt on Democracy Now! I think the revolution in Egypt was not only a turning point in history, but really a high point for independent media in this country. I was glad to see so many hands go up when you said you followed the revolution on Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera English, and it was to Free Speech TV's great credit that they ran 12 hours of Al Jazeera English every day, and people tuned into that because there's an effective censorship of that network in this country. For Democracy Now! There were 3 of us who went to Egypt, myself, Hani Massoud, and Anjali Kamat. And I think our coverage was unique for a number of reasons that are endemic to independent media. And one of those is that the philosophy of Democracy Now! Is to allow people's voices to be heard, to give voice to the voiceless. Juan Gonzalez, is the co-host of Democracy Now!, is here as well, once told me, just listen to people. And so that's what we tried to do on Democracy Now! We just pointed the camera at people and said, why are you here? And you heard in English, or you heard in Arabic, you heard men and women, rich and poor, old and young, religious and secular, talk about their hopes, their dreams, what they're calling for, their frustrations. What you saw in most of the US corporate networks was a bird's eye view of Tahrir and a sea of people that looked like ants, and a lot of pundits and analysts explaining why this was happening and why this mattered to the US or to Israel. And so I think that's the main difference of our coverage. I arrived in Tahrir on January 29th. The revolution started on the 25th. I was in Park City, Utah, of all places, when it started, covering the Sundance Film Festival, of all things, which was a celebration of independent film. But I, like so many Egyptians, thought that this protest, which was planned to mark National Police Day on January 25th, would be like so many others before it, would be a few dozen people surrounded by 10 times the number of very feared state and central security forces. They'd be beaten, they'd be dispersed, they'd be arrested, and it would be over. But I was very wrong. And for the first time in my life, I watched on TV from Park City, Utah, Egyptians take to the streets. I saw footage of people tearing down billboards of Hosni Mubarak in public squares. This is something that was unthinkable just 3 weeks ago, or before January 25th. And they were met with a lot of state violence, with a lot of tear gas, with a lot of batons, with live ammunition. But for the first time, all sectors of Egyptian society came together, and they had had enough. And they battled the Interior Ministry's forces, and they won. And what they won was the streets. And that they changed the power structure in Egypt irrevocably in those days, from the 25th to the 28th. And in Cairo, they won Tahrir, and they marched in triumphant. And so I was watching this on TV, going crazy. And I remember on Thursday, before the so-called Day of Rage on the 28th, on Friday, which is when they won the streets, my cousin Muhammad called me from Egypt. My cell phone rang. We had just finished the Democracy Now! Broadcast. And he said, "Cousin, tomorrow we're going to overthrow the government." And he said, "I don't care what's going to happen to me. I don't care if I die. At least it'll be doing something worthy." And this is not a revolutionary activist. This is a successful movie producer. And so that's when I realized that I had to go home. But I arrived the day after the Day of Rage, by the time I made it back. And I went straight from the airport to Tahrir. And the first thing I saw was the party headquarters of the National Democratic Party, Hosni Mubarak's party, a blackened hollow shell that was still smoking. And I went into Tahrir, and thousands of Egyptians were there. I'd never seen so many of my brothers and sisters together in a public space except for at a soccer match, because it's illegal in Egypt, since we've been living under emergency law since 1981, to gather in a public space. And they were fearless and they were determined. And I remember I wrote down in my notepad, I said, this is not Hosni Mubarak's Egypt anymore, and regardless of what happens, it will never be again. And that turned out to be true. Now, one thing I think independent media is, or independent journalists are very good at, is that they're very savvy about getting the story out. And one thing the Egyptian government did in a desperate bid to try and quell these protests was to completely shut down communication networks. So on the 28th, they shut down the cell phone networks in Egypt, all three of them. And in a move that's unprecedented in world history, they shut down the internet completely to zero. So they cut Egypt off entirely from the digital world. This did not have the effect that they wanted at all, because I actually spoke to a number of people who weren't as active in protesting before, and they said, oh, you know, I was going to stay at home and I was going to watch maybe on YouTube and check out Facebook and look at Twitter and see what was happening, but I couldn't even call my friends, so I hit the streets. But so this is the Cairo that I descended to, and it was very hard to get any word out. You can't use your cell phone. The only way to really do anything was to go home or go to a hotel and use a landline. But luckily, my US cell phone could text the US. So a very good friend of mine, Jeremy Scahill, who many of you know, who's I think our generation's best investigative journalist, got the idea, said, give me your Twitter password. So I gave him my password, and I just kept texting Jeremy from Tahrir, and he would post it on Twitter. So these were some of the only tweets coming from Tahrir during those first few days when the internet was down. And because of that, and I wasn't writing Shakespeare or anything, it was just because it was the only updates that people could get, my number of Twitter followers went from 2,000 to 27,000. When the internet turned back on, my Gmail said, you have 17,000 new messages. So that's one thing I think that independent journalists are usually better at. We would file our pieces. Hani Masood, who was the camera person working with me, TV producer, we would shoot all day in Tahrir and then compress our pieces and send them out via FTP. And you lose some quality when you do that. But I think we value, as independent media, we value content more than production value. And so we're willing to lose that quality. And so we would do that. And I wasn't watching the US TV networks, but I later found out that there was very little coverage from actually street level in the square, talking to people. And so this is another benefit from independent journalists. And I think a key thing as well is that we always talk about independent journalists, but we embrace community media. We embrace community voices. And I think the strength of democracy now is that I was Egyptian, Hani Masood is Egyptian, Anjali Kama lived in Cairo for 2 years and speaks fluent Arabic. When you're from the community, I understood the language, I could walk with the protesters, I have a national ID card. I look like a protester, and people will trust me and talk to me, and it's very different, and it became very dangerous, in fact, for Western journalists to even walk around. And we saw that crackdown by the regime. The regime tried to harass a lot of Western journalists, but when we see these conglomerates buying up all these community media outlets, what they're really doing is destroying a sense of understanding, because community voices are essential to any kind of reporting, I think. And you know, when I would go home, I wouldn't go home to a hotel room with my media colleagues. I'd go home and I would hear what my grandmother had to say, what my uncle had to say, what my cousins had to say, and that also helps understanding as well. And so, community media, I think, is a key point in all of this. Let me just end on the issue of social media just briefly. A lot of people have been calling this the Facebook revolution. Now, there's no question that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube were key tools to this uprising. Egypt is ranked as number 5 in the number of users that use Facebook in the world. Now, I just think it's a very Western concept to call this a Facebook revolution. This is just a new, Twitter and Facebook and all the social media we are using, they're key. There was a 28-year-old businessman in Alexandria in June of 2010 called Khaled Saeed, who had allegedly posted some video of some police officers dividing up the spoils of a drug bust, money and drugs. He was in an internet cafe in Alexandria. They walked up to him. They told him to get up and come with them. He refused. They dragged him out. They took him to an alley and they beat his head against a wall until he died. The photos of his broken face were taken by a cell phone and distributed by his brother on Facebook, and they enraged Egyptians from all walks of society. There were protests around the country at the time. This was back in June. A Google executive in Dubai called Wael Ghunaim, who's Egyptian, started anonymously a Facebook page called Kullina Khaled Saeed, which means we're all Khaled Saeed. This became the biggest Facebook page in Egypt, and he was the first to call for these protests on January 25th. We also saw on January 18th a young woman called Asma Mahfouz, who had been protesting for years, who had been arrested by police, who had been beaten, very bravely post a video of herself just speaking directly into the camera, challenging Egyptians to come out on January 25th, challenging men to join her in standing up to Mubarak's regime, and that was key as well. So I'm not trying to downplay social media, but just like the radio was once, the newspaper was once, pamphlets were once, this is a networking tool, and to deny Egyptians years of struggle and organizing that really made this uprising happen, I think is incorrect. But I'll just leave it there, and just finally, on the corporate media, I missed a lot of the coverage, but I was very happy when I came back to learn that it was wall-to-wall coverage. That the Pew Center, I think, did a study that was the biggest international story covered on the US corporate network since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, in the beginning, you would hear this false objectivity that's so endemic to our media that, well, the protesters say this, but Hosni Mubarak says this, and that's not journalism, that's called stenography if you're just repeating what people are saying. When journalists came under attack, Anderson Cooper was punched in the head in Tahrir, Christian Amanpour was attacked. I think you saw a change in Anderson Cooper's coverage. He started calling things as they are. He started saying, this is a pro-democracy movement, this is a peaceful popular uprising that's being attacked with violence from a US-backed regime. That's what journalism is, calling things as they are. And I think that's what independent media is so good at. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharif. As he learned, it's not only, it's hard to write Shakespeare, it's even harder to tweet Shakespeare. And when he talks about how mainstream media goes from crisis to crisis to crisis, they went from the Egypt crisis to the Japan crisis to the biggest crisis of all, the Charlie Sheen crisis. Our next panelist is Marcy Wheeler. She blogs as Empty Wheel at Fire Dog Lake. She exposed press corruption in her book, Anatomy of Deceit, How the Bush Administration Used the Media to Sell the Iraq War and How to Spy. She live blogged the Scooter Libby trial. He's the chief of staff for Vice President Cheney. In early February, when Secretary of State Clinton was insisting that supporting Egypt's Vice President Omar Suleiman was the path to democracy, Marcy was offering a slightly different reality, blogging day after day about Suleiman as, quote, America's torturer. Marcy Wheeler.
It's really humbling to follow Sharif because, like many of you, I'm one of those kind of quintessential bloggers who sits in her pajamas in Michigan and covers what I can cover, and I was just as reliant on you for Sharif's tweets as anybody else was. So Fire Dog Lake is not big enough, nor do we have the skill sets needed to go and risk our lives and our safety and our freedom in Egypt to cover this, and so it's humbling. That said, we do and did try, and there were things that we are able to cover that I think are important to the debate. We do kind of the curation that a lot of bloggers do. I am kind of notorious for my document dumps. I go in and weed stuff out and find out how many times we tortured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for example. This post, which I wanted to draw your attention to, is from this morning that Shun does. She has a lot of conversations with Middle Eastern activists. She does a weekly post on this. And this also just happened last night. She had been working on Twitter with a young Bahraini woman who was documenting kind of the crackdown on Bahraini activists, and last night her father and brother got arrested. And so this is up on the front page of Fire Dog Lake right now, and at the bottom there's a bunch of phone numbers that you can call if you're so inclined to kind of beat up on Americans who are letting Bahrain really crack down on their activists in a way that they were a little more squeamish about in the case of Egypt. And that, I think, gets to where somebody like me has an obligation to cover events in the Middle East, in North Africa, and Afghanistan. And it's there are these two stories. There's this amazing, inspiring story about activists in Egypt, and then there's a story about our responsibility as American citizens in kind of the late American empire and the degree to which the American empire has relied on Hosni Mubarak for the last generation. And therefore, we, in many ways, our government in many ways has empowered that dictatorship and many others around the world. So the stories I think that we are responsible for telling, Jeff brought up Omar Suleiman. If you don't know, he is the guy who, there was a detainee, Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who was captured in Afghanistan in 2001. And the FBI was interrogating him, and then one day the CIA came up, wrapped him in duct tape, sent him on a plane to Egypt, and he was tortured personally. Suleiman, this guy that Hillary Clinton said that, he's going to be our shepherd of democracy in Egypt, personally involved in the torture of this detainee. And the detainee, under that torture, claimed that there were ties between al-Qaeda and Iraq, and that is one of the pieces of intelligence that got us into Iraq. Suleiman also traveled to, then this detainee kind of got bopped around our secret prison system, eventually ended up back in Libya. He was Libyan originally, and in 2009, just as a lot of our torture was becoming public, and particularly the role of torture in inventing an excuse to go into the Iraq war, al-Libi was suicided, and Suleiman was actually in Libya at the time that happened. It was very convenient that all of a sudden he died. That's one of the stories that I think we, as Americans, are obligated to tell and to have told in this country. Another one is the looting that Mubarak and Gaddafi and everybody else has been doing for many years. The traditional media paid some attention to the way they moved their money around in the weeks of the early uprising, and as a result were successful at getting some of it out. One of the reasons Gaddafi is being so resilient is that he's got money in Libya that he can use to pay his mercenaries. But what they didn't tell is that for, again, a generation, we sat there and watched as Mubarak took money, looted from his people, and moved the money into often British or American bank accounts. And our financial economy really relies on all of this money being dumped from the elite who are looting their people in Egypt. And gosh, do you think there's a relationship between the fact that we allow that to happen? And then the other thing that I think the independent media did do a good job of covering was the degree to which our neoliberal policies, the economic policies that we've been pushing down. I know there was a lot of news domestically yesterday, but did anyone see that Obama yesterday, as food prices are back historical highs, said we need to dump more money into ethanol? Anybody see that? That's a completely immoral decision, because what it's going to do is drive food prices up all around the world, and food scarcity was one of the issues that's driving this. So, those are the stories that I think we have an obligation to tell. But it's this. But what we, to some degree, rely on, me sitting in my pajamas in Michigan blogging, is Mika Sifri yesterday referred to transnational media, and I think maybe with the Green Revolution in Iran, it is real that Sharif can write his tweets, and to the extent he can get them out, we can cover it in the United States, and there will be some accounting for what's going on the other side of the world. And I think, those bloggers of us sitting in our pajamas are particularly reliant on it. But there's this really remarkable moment where our government is facing the end of its empire, or facing the kind of beginning weakness of the empire, and their information policies, the policies on social media or on the degree to which these stories move transnationally are really interesting. And I just want to bring up 4 data points on this, because I think it's a testament to both how they're trying to control information here, but also some of the dangers that some of the areas where they're going to come after us. One is the story of Raymond Davis. Raymond Davis is an American who was in Pakistan, who killed 2 Pakistanis. His cover story was, "They tried to rob me, and I was defending myself." But very quickly, the Pakistani media made it clear, and to their credit, the traditional media here in the United States made it fairly clear he was arrested with a GPS satellite, with a phone with some very interesting pictures, with phone numbers of a bunch of people in the tribal areas in Pakistan. And, it became clear this guy was not your average consular employee, which is what we were claiming he was. And in Pakistan, the mobs who were insisting that he get a trial, and the people who were holding him, were all very clearly saying he's a spy. The traditional media here in the United States knew that. They had that story. He was arrested in late January, and they sat on it because the administration went to them and said, "Can you sit on this?" And then eventually, around February 21st, The Guardian reported it, and then the New York Times came out and said, "Well, gosh, yeah, we had the story, but we didn't publish it. The administration told us not to." And they said that if we publish, and it was sort of ridiculous because the people who were a risk to Raymond Davis, the Pakistani mobs, the people who held him prison, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan, all knew or were working under the assumption he was a spy. So the only people who didn't know were us, were the people who rely on the New York Times for their news. And if you think about it, there are only 2 explanations for why the administration fought so hard to prevent that information from being published. And all of them did it. New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, AP, all of them sat on this information. And the logic behind that, I can think of just 2 reasons. One is because Obama was going out publicly and saying he's a diplomat. And no one in the press was correcting that, okay? So that's one reason they didn't want us to know, because then we would all know that Obama was lying to us to be able to make a stake that this guy had some claim to immunity. And then the other reason is Davis was not a CIA spy. He's a contractor and has ties to Blackwater. And to a large degree, the reason they didn't want us to know the story, I think, is because it confirmed, we're going to hail Jeremy Scahill, I think, all day. But Scahill had been reporting on the contractors in Pakistan for quite some time, and CENTCOM had come out and said, "Oh, nonsense," and this confirmed what he was saying, which is that we've got contractors in Pakistan, and all of the sensitivities that we in the United States have about the contractors, shooting people in Iraq and now Pakistan, I think they managed to avoid some of the outrage about that by not publishing this. So that's one data point. Second data point, P.J. Crowley, he's the guy who got ousted from the State Department because he said that the treatment of Bradley Manning was ridiculous, counterproductive, and stupid. P.J. Crowley was the spokesperson of the State Department until about 3 weeks ago. And at that point, he said that the treatment of Bradley Manning, who's the alleged WikiLeaks leaker, and particularly the forced nudity that the government was using with him, was ridiculous, counterproductive, and stupid. Within a couple of days, Obama was asked a question about it, and then immediately Bill Daley had made sure that Crowley was gone by the end of the week. But this is something Crowley said about social media in January. So after Tunisia, before Egypt, and it's just ripe with irony, so I wanted to read it. He said this to a class in DC. "We express concern about the plight of journalists or bloggers around the world who are intimidated, jailed, or even killed by governments that are afraid of their people and afraid of the empowerment that comes with the free flow of information within a civil society." Most recently, we did so in the context of Tunisia, which has hacked social media accounts while claiming to protect their citizens from the incitement of violence. But in doing so, we feel the government is unduly restricting the ability of its people to assemble and express their views in order to influence government policies. These are universal principles that we continue to support, and we practice what we preach. And he went on to address WikiLeaks, which I'm going to return to in just a second. But it is true that the State Department, and you actually see this in the WikiLeaks cables, it's true that the State Department does support activists. There was reporting a couple weeks ago about that they've spent $50 million for a panic button for democracy activists overseas, so that they can wipe out all their address book and their phone immediately and send a warning to other activists. This is at the same time as our government is stopping people as they come, stopping people like David House, who's tied to WikiLeaks, as he comes into the country and taking his laptop so that they can get all the content. There's this wonderful irony. Third data point, Dianne Feinstein, bless her soul. She's wrong on most policy issues, but she has this very unique ability. If you watch her carefully, particularly in her role on the Senate Intelligence Committee, occasionally she'll admit the truth in very useful ways. And she did this in the case of social media, because she laid into the intelligence community after Egypt, because there was this, in the press it was, how come you didn't tell us Egypt, how come you didn't tell us Mubarak is about to be overthrown? And the intelligence community came back and said, well, how are we supposed to know that a fruit vendor in Tunisia, in the Tunisian desert, was going to let himself on fire? And that's how they got out of any kind of responsibility for warning it. But what Feinstein's point was, and this is amazing and it's true and you can see it in the WikiLeaks cables as well, is that our intelligence community, at least up until January, wasn't following democracy activists on social media. Our intelligence community spends a lot of time in Al-Qaeda chat rooms, right? So they're spending a lot of time monitoring particular groups of people online. But what both the State Department and the intelligence community were completely not following, even after like the January 25th protests in Egypt, even after events in Tunisia, the Facebook event, there's this great State Department cable where they talk about the Egyptian government coming back to the State Department and saying, wow, we can't get anybody to listen to our propaganda, but with this just one Facebook site, they were able to bring out X thousands of people in a protest. And so the State Department knew the power of social media as a tool, but they weren't actually following the content of it. And there's another great cable where they were talking with an April 6th activist, so somebody who went on to be really involved in the events of the last several months. And they had actually helped the April 6th movement. They had gotten their YouTube account turned back on when the Egyptian government turned it off. I mean, so they actually do support these people to some degree. But he basically said to the State Department, our goal is to overthrow Mubarak before elections in 2011. And the State Department, it was just dripped with condescension. They're like, that's not the opinion of the mainstream people who are opposition figures in Egypt. And they basically said, there's no way on God's earth that they're going to be able to overthrow Mubarak, so we're going to continue to support him. And so they were wrong. But it's this wonderful moment, I think, where the State Department, I mean, you all following Sharif know more about what's going on in Egypt than our spy community. And maybe that overstates it slightly, but that is an incredibly powerful thought, that being able to follow in real time on Twitter allows both bloggers but also just citizens to be able to say, this is what's going on the other side of the world, but our government, of course, is still going to operate under the old assumptions. So WikiLeaks, and I'm going to close with this. Let me take a show of hands. PJ Crowley said it's horrible for Tunisia's government to hack the social media sites of activists there. How many people in this room believe that the government had some role in bringing down the WikiLeaks site in early December, making it inaccessible in this country? A good many of you. There has been almost no discussion. There's been a little bit of coverage after the fact, after State Department admitted that, the WikiLeaks disclosures weren't all that terrible, but they had said so because it made it legally easier to go to PayPal and Visa and everybody else to take WikiLeaks down. So there was some legal process behind what the government did to what is essentially a media outlet, right? But we don't know what it is. And one of the really interesting things about that fact, and the fact that they're stopping activists at the border and taking their laptops, is that in December, Attorney General Holder said that we're conducting an espionage investigation of WikiLeaks. The Patriot Act is useful for two kinds of investigations. One is counterterrorism, so they can use it to investigate Al-Qaeda. The other one is espionage. And many of the laws in the Patriot Act basically say, so for example, they can get the business records of anybody they want, so long as the Attorney General goes to a judge and says, this is for an espionage investigation. And you don't even have to be connected. They can go and get my business records if they want to. They can say, well, we think there might be, Marcy Wheeler writes a lot about Bradley Manning, so we might find something, so we're going to go get her business records. And, I don't know that they used the Patriot Act. The fact that they did this Twitter order to get the Twitter background of a bunch of activists suggests that they at least are trying to get evidence that they aren't embarrassed to admit into a court proceeding, but we don't know. And that's part of the issue, is that our government overseas is happy to give democracy activists panic switches, but they're really assaulting the notion of democracy here in this country and beginning to increasingly treating us reporting on what our own government is doing as espionage. And yeah, and I think that's kind of where they're going to go after the independent media as we go forward, is to go ahead and hack them, or go ahead and defund them, or go ahead and the good news is they're no longer arresting and shooting Al Jazeera journalists the way they were several years ago, at least not as much as they did, but they're still taking this incredibly hostile view to journalists within their own country, particularly independent journalists.
Marcy Wheeler. If it weren't for conferences like this, I don't know that we'd ever get Marcy out of Michigan or out of her pajamas. Our next panelist is Derek Crow. He's a political director at Brave New Foundation, which runs the RethinkAfghanistan.com. How many people have seen the materials from Rethink? He's done communications work for Democratic Congress members on Capitol Hill and at the National Office of the Children's Defense Fund. His writing's been featured at Huffington Post, Alternet, and he blogs from a Christian nonviolence perspective at his own site, returngood.com. Derek Crow.
I think we're all just going to keep getting more humble as we go along here, because I got to say that the panelists on this stage, I'm absolutely fans of your work, and I admire you greatly. So it's a really great pleasure to be able to present with all of you. Like you said, my name is Derek Crow. I am the political director at Brave New Foundation. I run the Rethink Afghanistan campaign. And I want to start by asking the audience a question. How many of you know the word Gardez? Okay, a couple, right? How many of you know the word Sangin? Okay, now, there's a reason I'm going to tell you the stories of these places, but the fact that you don't know about these two massacres that happened in Afghanistan points out the deep problem we have with the media in our country, especially with the international reporting. I'll start with Gardez, and there are some people in this room who did fantastic work, Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera and folks like that deserve our thanks for the reporting they did on these stories. But it was largely the shops like that and like Rethink Afghanistan that got the word out about these stories, and it was solely almost independent media. Gardez was the home of a man, is the hometown of a man named Commander Daoud, who trained with U.S. forces to become the local police commander in his town. One night, he and his family were celebrating the birth of a new baby boy into their family, and after the music had died down and after the people had gone to sleep, one of the guests had wandered outside about in the wee hours of the morning, and a flashlight was shown in his face, and this town is on the edge of Taliban territory, and instantly he thought the Taliban are here to get us. So he runs back into the family complex shouting, "The Taliban are here." U.S. Special Forces with Afghan counterparts appeared on the rooftops of this family compound, and as Commander Daoud, who trained with U.S. troops, was running across the courtyard of that compound, was shot. When his brother realized that these were American forces and ran out of the building and said, "Don't shoot, we work for the government," he was shot. As he was shot, the three women behind them, two of them who were pregnant, were also hit. In the aftermath of that shooting, two of the people bled to death while U.S. Special Forces were refusing to allow people to go for help, for medical attention, while they did their best to hide the evidence of what they had done once it became apparent to them who they had shot. And that included digging bullets out of the bodies of the people who were there, one of whom was still alive. The bullets were removed from the walls, and the story that was fed up the command chain was that the U.S. Special Forces had stumbled across the executed bodies of women who were killed execution style by Taliban militants. Now, when an international reporter named Jerome Starkey began to report on this story, he was instantly smeared by NATO forces as an inaccurate reporter that did a smear campaign around Kabul to try to discredit him. And it took people like Rethink Afghanistan and Democracy Now! And folks in the international media like Al Jazeera reporting on that smear campaign to save that journalist's job and reputation in Afghanistan, but also to get that story into the mainstream media. And like you said, almost no one in the room had heard the word Gardez. But it was a massacre of one of our allies in Afghanistan that was then actively lied about in the US media for weeks by NATO spokespeople in Afghanistan. The second place I mentioned is a place called Sangin. This is a town, or a region, in Afghanistan that was so violent in southern Afghanistan that the British handed it off to the United States because it was costing them so many casualties. When U.S. forces moved in several months ago, there was a battle there that went back and forth across a civilian community. The elders and the leaders in the community sent the women and children from the community to a special building outside of town to hide from the violence. And a U.S. missile hit that building and killed all the people inside of it. And again, the military said that we hadn't killed anybody in Sangin, and that's just insurgent propaganda. And Rethink Afghanistan was able to get testimony from people on the ground to talk about what happened to help disprove that. And the reason I bring these up is that had any of these videos showed up on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, God help us, that already 2/3 of the American people already opposed this war. And we're seeing a very sanitized version of it. And if the true pictures and the true testimonies of this war were on our television every day, there would be a much deeper and more agitated opposition to this war. As it stands, about 4% of news coverage last year focused on Afghanistan. Now, out of that 4%, an enormous amount of that was generated by the PR efforts of the Pentagon. I'm sure in the middle of last year when General Petraeus took command in Afghanistan, all of you saw him on every television station talking about Afghanistan and how we're making progress. And actually we did a little video montage of the 27,000 times he said, making progress, making progress, making progress. Which, by the way, Dana Perino back in the Bush years was also saying. And of the rest of the set, another large portion is generated by embedded journalists who, in many cases, are just airdropped in for a showcase campaign like Marja, Operation Mushtarak there. And because of that, you only get the perspective of somebody who's traveling into an area and is only safe because of the protection of U.S. forces around them. And that is an enormously distorting effect on the reporting that comes out of those situations. So when looking at this situation, Rethink Afghanistan, we decided that one of the things we wanted to do was to get reporting done by local Afghans, and in the words of the Afghan people affected by it, out to the mainstream media, out to the people in America, in spite of the mainstream media. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick video here of a behind-the-scenes video that we did that talks about the work of our team there, led by a very brave woman named Anita Sridhar. So just give me a moment, I'll cue it up. Oh, Al Jazeera is streaming. You guys are hogging our.
Let him shut his tab.
Okay,
Sorry about
so
this.
we don't mind advertising for his work, by the way.
Independent media, we only have one laptop.
I know. Please support local independent media.
Is it good? Is it good? Okay.
Awesome.
So we're
I can go back to my.
You know, we played
Thank
some
you
really
very
good
much.
golf out there, and we fed off one another, and we got a bit of momentum early, and the crowd
That's
got
not
behind
mine.
us on the back nine and really pushed us along.
Sorry.
So I think we all really enjoyed.
There may be something running behind.
Should I close the others out? Is this yours?
That's mine. But that's,
South Korea's KJ Choi is
think there's
also in
another window that's
contention.
gotta be open.
He's 3 off the lead on 7 under par. Like Choi, world number 2.
There you go. Sorry.
awesome. I'll actually show you a video instead of showing you the behind-the-scenes video. I'll show you the kind of video that we're actually able to get out of Afghanistan through Anita's work. Anita and her team, she calls her team Banana Leaf Productions. And what they've done is we've basically smuggled in handheld flip cams and digital recorders that aren't very easy to get into Afghanistan, by the way, because the local power structure there does not want unembedded media coming out of Afghanistan. And we recorded in the native languages there how-tos on how to use these cameras. And Anita's team then distributed them to local bloggers who want to report on the situation in their country. And so to set this up, when the Sangin and Gardez incidents were finally reported in the US media, the way that reporting generally worked was there would be a guy standing there on CNN at CNN headquarters with just a map of Afghanistan behind him, describing what was happening. And if there was any live footage, it was almost always Department of Defense generated B-roll of just troops walking. And they would say things like, well, the US forces admitted they accidentally killed these 3 women, and they've issued an apology. Now, compare that with the video I'm about to show you that was gotten out of the country by some of the people that Anita works with. And I should, viewer discretion, some of this is very graphic.
در رابطه با واقعه لیل 22 بر 23 دلو 1388 شب جمعه بود که برای ما ساعت 2 بجه روز خبر داده شد از طرف مامایم و بچه های مامایم که از اون نواسه مامایم تولد شده بود. شب 6 بود، نشسته بودیم، محفل خوشی بود. شب 6 نواسه مامایم ما بود. ما در اونجا آرام نشسته بودیم تا 12 بجه شب. من همراه امی همه فقط ساعت 4:20 4:30 صبح بود که صدای فیر بلند شد. وقتی که ساعت 11 بجه شد که امی قوتای امریکایی که این خانه را محاصره کرده بودند در بالای بام ها بلند شده بودند و همه را به شهادت از بام زده بودند. در اوجا در روی حولی به شهادت رسانده بودند. یک وقتی است که ساعت 7:30 بجه صبح است که بچه مامایم محمد صابر آمد برای من گفت که دو حولی که دوجا قماندان صاحب داود که بچه مامایم بود گفت شهید شده. ظاهر که سارنوال ولسوالی احمد آبا بود گفت شهید شده. نامزاد بچه ما که منصور بچه من نامزادش بود شهید شده بود. دختر مامایم شهید شده بود. خانم بچه مامایم شهید شده بود و همچنان امین نواسه کاکایم و نواسه مامایم این 2 زخمی شده بود و یکی دختر مامایم که عروس شده بود هر کدام از این 7 ماه حامله‌دار بود. اردویش با فیر زدن کشتن. نه تنها این تو جنایت را انجام دادن که 2 خانم 3 خانم کشتن، بلکه 2 طفلش در رحمشون زدن شهید کردن. وقتی میبرایم برای من میگه نامزاد بچه تو و قماندان صاحب داود تا 15 دقیقه کم 7 صبح فردا که 4:30 بجه زخمی شده زنده بود، نسبت ضایع کردن خون زیاد که کسی دیگر اجازه نداد که به شفاخانه انتقال بدن جان به هم. تا 15 دقیقه کم 7 صبح زنده بوده.
قسمی که شما فرمودین که اینا بعض شایعات داشتن که مردمی که به شهادت رسیده بود این قبل از این حمله یا
قبل از اینکه یا بیاید نوشته کردن در تاریخ قبل از اینکه ما بیاییم ما آمدیم این 2 خانم و این 3 خانم و 2 نفر کشته شده بود. این خب به خاطر چی؟ این به خاطر ازی که اونمو عمل علمناک ظالمانه ای را که انجام داده در برابر ذهنیت بین المللی او را بپوشانه، لیکن برعکس ما در اوجا ولی من آرزومند هستم که جامعه مدنی، حقوق بشر، سازمان ملل متحد به آه و فریاد ما برسه و این موضوع را پیگیری بکنه و بالاخره یک نتیجه را به دست ما بده.
Now that's the end of the video, and I'll stop it there. And I know we're right before lunch, so I apologize for ruining any of your appetites here. But this is what the Afghanistan war looks like, told in the voice of people in Afghanistan in their own language, with video that they took of their own. That party video you see at the beginning of this clip is the night right before these men died. And the man who's dancing at the beginning in the dark coat is Commander Dawood. There is no reporting like this in the mainstream media. It is places like Rethink Afghanistan, like Democracy Now!, like Al Jazeera. It's bloggers like the folks at Firedog Lake who are committed to this and want to show Americans the truth about what's happening in Afghanistan. One thing you also are not going to hear about is the cost to you, and that's something that we're focused on this week as tax day is coming up. If you go to rethinkafghanistan.com, you can actually type in your income right now and get your bill for what you're going to pay on your income taxes to support this war. Now, I can't state strongly enough how vital it is that we support independent media in the United States, from the folks that are represented on this panel and around the other panels going on right now. Because otherwise, these pictures are never going to get in front of Americans. And you're going to continue to have a video game portrayal of drone strikes from 30,000 feet hitting things that look like ants on the ground and talking about how great it is that American troops don't die when that happens. So I'll turn it over because I know we're pressed for time, but I just want to say again that the panel that's been put together here is fantastic, and I'm a great admirer of everyone here, and I hope that everyone, when we leave this conference, will find ways to support independent media in their hometown and around the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. We're running a little long. I'm going to ask Tim, where are you, if we could go over a little bit on our end time. Okay, since we're coming up against lunch. But I want to introduce our last speaker. I'm already getting great questions from you, which we're going to get to as soon as our final speaker is finished. That's Ahmed Shihab-Eldin. He's a perpetual nomad, multimedia journalist, now at Al Jazeera English. He's originally Palestinian. He grew up in California, Kuwait, Egypt, and Vienna. He's reported from various countries in the Middle East, taught new media at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where he won his master's. He's a producer and co-host of The Stream, which is a web community, soon to launch a TV show, a daily show on Al Jazeera English. Ahmed.
Hello, I know we're pressed for time. It's really exciting for me to be here. I'll be honest, as I'm sure many of you can imagine, over the past couple weeks, even months, I've been going around speaking at various panels, participating in panels, trying to build this show, which is focused around social media, and that's been somewhat of a challenge, but I can honestly say that although this is somewhat smaller than a lot of the bigger conferences I've been to, such as South by Southwest, it really is an honor for me to be here because I really do value the kind of work that everyone here is doing. And it's going to be a big part of our show, which I'll eventually get to. And it's an honor, as I said, to be here, but since there's nobody after me to say how humbled they are by my thing, I think I'll just get straight to what I'm going to do. I'd love to show a 5-minute video that I put together with a friend of mine and a colleague, Ben Connors, who is working on our show as well. We created the video for a show called Empire, which airs on Al Jazeera. And the reason I want to show that video is because it's a lot more articulate than me. And I spent a lot of time trying to package it. The point of the video is to highlight, I think, what we're all talking about here, which is the ways in which social media, as well as independent media, can really, I think, revolutionize not just countries, but also the way in which we perceive each other and the way in which we connect to each other. So for the next 1 minute before I play it, but thank you for dimming the lights, I just want to mention something about what Sharif said regarding Egypt and what happened yesterday. You know, I think this is just an anecdote that's really emblematic of how media is changing and how we consume media and how important independent media is and social media. So I obviously have been busy at this panel trying to meet people, but this morning I woke up and I saw something on Storify. Now, how many of you are familiar with that tool? Anybody? Okay. Well, hopefully I'll be more familiar with it since we're partnering with the company to build our show, this stream. The whole idea, just very briefly, is to aggregate social media comments and tweets and Facebook posts from all over the world. Anyone can do it. It's currently in private beta. But the reason I mention this is because someone had created a Storify about the events that happened yesterday in Tahrir Square. And, you know, usually I would maybe, you know, watch, you know, CNN or some Al Jazeera or one of those TV shows in my hotel room as I doze off, but I didn't. And I woke up and I just quickly checked Storify, and there it was. And there was one person who tweeted in particular whose name is IN in Egypt. And it came through on my tweet deck, and that's how I came across this story. And essentially, the story was just, you know, an aggregation and a curation of all these tweets and Facebook posts. And I think there's a lot more to be said about that, but because we're running late, I'll just make maybe 1 or 2 comments after the video. And I know that a lot of you, according to Jeff, he said a lot of you want to know how you can watch Al Jazeera. Hopefully I can answer that. If not, I have someone here from the PR department of Al Jazeera who would be more than happy to talk to you afterwards. So let me just try and sort this out and play this. Oh, great. Anyone know how to recently closed tabs? There we go. I had to close it. Forgive me. Al Jazeera has this extremely horrible, we do a lot of things well, but one thing we don't do well on YouTube is because we're live streaming, because we are not available on cable here, it auto-plays, which I think is somewhat problematic, but here we go. The live stream.
Fighters had the upper hand because
See,
they
I have to turn that
outnumbered
off. See, I mean, who does this?
Gaddafi.
1 second. I keep telling them. All right, there we go. I'll just let it load so it doesn't stop halfway through. I have a little anecdote at the very end of this that I want to read, which is a tweet from Sharif, because it's worth mentioning that I grew up in Egypt for 10 years, and I think he knows my sister quite well, and I knew him when I was in Egypt. And when I was following this for my job, which my job in December was to follow Twitter and follow Facebook and see if, you know, anything's happening. And you know, in late December, about a week or 2 after Mohammed Bouazizi, and this also prefaces the video, a week or 2 after Mohammed Bouazizi, you know, burned himself on fire, set himself on fire, I started to see students protesting, and schools were shut down, and you know, people in Egypt were doing solidarity protests as early as December, late December, and I kept telling my boss, well, you know, something's happening in Tunisia, and I by no means was like breaking the story. I mean, other people were doing the same thing. I think it wasn't clear, so this is hopefully going to clarify for all of us the role of social media. And it's just 5 minutes, so there we go.
After more than 2 decades of rule by
Tunisia's revolution has marked its place in history.
Tunisia is now a country in chaos.
But it didn't happen overnight. And weeks before the world's mainstream media woke up to the story, tweets, photos, and videos began popping up on the internet from Tunisia, warning of trouble to come. A fruit and vegetable seller from Sidi Bouzid had set himself on fire on December 18th, and suddenly, reactions on the Twitterverse were exploding. Following the hashtag Sidi Bouzid, I called up hundreds of photos and videos showing students protesting, police abuses, and sporadic gunfire. As the messages went viral, protests broke out across the world showing solidarity with Tunisia.
Tunisian unrest makes waves in Lausanne.
Demo tomorrow outside the Tunisian embassy in London.
A flash mob is planned in Berlin on Saturday.
The beginning of a revolution was unfolding, and the mainstream media was just beginning to catch up.
There are no reporters in Tunisia to tell us what's really happening.
About this sooner. Mass media has totally failed.
Terrorism equals lots of media coverage. Democratic revolution equals little media coverage.
Tunisia's government began hacking into and deleting Facebook accounts. Protesters called for help from hacktivist groups.
An unprecedented crackdown on social media.
Censorship should get in touch with hacktivists and
we really need a local version of Anonymous in the Arab world.
And soon enough, another hashtag appeared across the networks. Anonymous.
The Tunisian government has decided it wants to restrict the freedoms of their own people. In doing so, the Tunisian government has made itself an enemy of Anonymous.
Within a matter of hours, Anonymous launched Operation Tunisia, paralyzing the president's site, several key ministries, and the stock exchange. The group also shared a cyber war survival guide, sharing cables from Wikileaks documenting Ben Ali's corruption, tips on running from cops, and proxy sites to access Facebook and Twitter. The government quickly countered with a phishing operation, stealing Facebook and email passwords to spy on activists and obliterate online dissent. But tweets continued to spread, documenting a society's breakdown.
The internet is reportedly cut off from Sidi
People are
Bouzid
creating barricades to protect their neighborhood.
Students demonstrating in Klubia, 50 miles
Injured
east of
young man shot by police in his back in Kafsa.
For a full week, I watched the story unfold online, speaking to activists, using Facebook and Twitter as protests turned bloody. And on January 12th, with Ben Ali's regime on the verge of collapse, Time magazine finally found the story. But the social networks had the best coverage. A new power structure had emerged, and protests had spread to other countries, and governments scrambled to buy time.
Algeria steps up grain imports.
King Abdallah of Jordan sacks government.
Plus free food for a year to keep calm.
But the anger had already rooted itself inside Arab minds. Through social networks, Egyptians had began drawing connections in late December.
Egyptians should copy Tunisia revolt.
Toppling their dictator. That will start a chain reaction in the Arab world.
Tunisia solidarity demo on Sunday.
Inspired by Tunisia's success, finally, the fear factor had broken. January 25th, a public holiday in Egypt, marking the day in 1952 that saw police back up the Egyptian people's resistance against British occupation. As people organized, they drew upon Tunisia's success, sharing pamphlets on peaceful protesting and self-defense. They made plans to circumvent police barricades, quickly capturing the world's attention. But Mubarak also learned from Tunisia. On January 27, just as President Obama appeared live on YouTube answering questions from the public, Egypt's president took the unprecedented step of shutting down the internet. But he was too late. The World Wide Web was against him. The accounts of police abuse and violence circulated online, including footage that the Associated Press picked up showing what some have called Egypt's Neda moment. A coalition of volunteers, organizations, and activists set up platforms to get the message out.
Egyptians, email me if you want to post info on Twitter.
To break the block on Twitter, use this proxy.
Hotline numbers for legal aid and requesting lawyers. 010.
Even journalists in Egypt used their cell phones to send tweets to friends who relayed their messages.
Internet's still down in Egypt. We'll continue to tweet via
Shireen is safe. She just doesn't have internet access. So I'm tweeting on her behalf.
To stop any news getting out, the government went after the media. Journalists were detained, and the US government, which had been waffling in its response, turned to Twitter to make their voice heard.
We are concerned by the shutdown of Al Jazeera in Egypt and the arrest of its correspondents. Egypt must be open and the reporters released.
30 minutes later, our journalists were released, showing that even governments can use social media to get things done. Thank you. Thanks. Honestly, I know we want to get directly to the questions, but since we're running over a bit, if I could make a couple comments about why we showed that video and a little bit about the stream. I think, for me, on a personal level, as a human being, but also as a journalist, and on a professional level, it was extremely difficult to see what was happening in the Arab world, especially at the beginning, because it was very confusing. Because we didn't really understand where this would all lead, and I think that's still something that's a pressing issue for all of us. But one thing that I think is important, even though this makes a case for how central a role social media played, I think it's important, as Sharif said, it doesn't matter what we call these things. And for a couple weeks after the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt happened, there was a lot of, I think, wasting of time talking about, should we call this a Jasmine revolution, should we call it a Twitter revolution? I mean, honestly, who cares? The issue is, or the more important thing I think, is that we learned some lessons from what happened. There have been generations before who have been dissatisfied, as Sharif said. These have been long pressing issues: poverty, oppression, unemployment, lots of things. And essentially, I think it's important that we learn the lesson, and for me the main lesson is that the democratization of media, or the democratization of the Arab world, or the potential democratization of any part of the world for that matter, is directly related to the democratization of media. And I think that's also part of the reason why we're all here. And even though this video is aired on Al Jazeera, I'll quickly mention that this was me and a friend and a colleague named Ben who did it on a laptop alone, sourcing tweets from people who we had been following. And it was edited not in an edit bay, it was done on a laptop in about 2 to 3 days. Which shows you how talented this kid is. But also, I think I just wanted to quickly mention that 70% of people in the Arab world are under 29. I think that's something really important to highlight, because there's over 40,000 blogs in the Arab world that are updated every day and that are extremely relevant for the online community there. And there are a couple of facts that I just wanted to quickly throw out, because everyone talks about, well, what role did social media play in these revolutions? I think what the role it played is, as again some of the panelists mentioned, it just served as an accelerator and it amplified the revolutions. They would have happened anyway, just like even the Gutenberg press did at one point. It's just each kind of era has its own form of social media. But a couple of interesting developments that I also wanted to mention about what's happening now as a result of this is, even at Al Jazeera and I think other mainstream news organizations, but also independent journalists, you're starting to see that patterns that you saw happen in Tunisia initially, where people mobilized online, started to happen in Egypt and Yemen and Algeria and so on and so forth. But I think also within the media, you're starting to see certain patterns about how activists use certain tools to mobilize, to organize, to get their message out, and to do what they do better. I think you're starting to see news organizations start to, incorporate those in the way in which they gather their news, especially at Al Jazeera. And in fact, I think that's why I have a job, in the sense that, our talk show is going to be centered around these things, tapping into communities where there is already a very lively discussion about these issues, where they're very aware of the real issues that you don't often see on the mainstream media. And I know I'm running through this, so forgive me for being scattered. But the last two things I'll say is, I noticed the other day on my TweetDeck feed, or on Twitter, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Egypt now has a Twitter account, and they're very active, and it's in English as well as Arabic, which is, I think, telling. I think a lot of independent journalists, there's a girl, I don't know if you guys know her, but one of our elements of our show is that we create Storifys, which are essentially using this curation tool. And one of the stories we've done recently, which I won't plug the website because that would be too presumptuous, is that there's this girl named Rachel Anderson. And I say girl because she's 26 and she's from North Dakota and she's an independent journalist and she was reporting in Egypt. And she used Kickstarter to essentially keep on reporting once Libya happened, and she moved to Libya, she traveled to Libya, and she's now in Libya trying to cover the Libyan uprising, battle, war, whatever you want to call it, from a youth perspective. And the way she's doing it is by funding herself through online donations. And it's incredible. We managed to speak to her on Skype from Libya, and I've spoken to other people on Skype from Libya and Tunisia. And me being unable to be there, I think is really, I can still cover the story, and I think so many of us can still cover the story, including Rachel. And I think that's something to highlight. Last thing I'll say, done. And then we'll go to your questions. No, one last thing, sorry. See, I'm not clear. That's one issue I'm going to have to sort out before the show. This is a tweet, for what it's worth. It's a bit cheesy that I'm ending with this. But it really is one of the tweets that I favorited, which I never really do, although it's a very important tool. And it's going to be, I think, moving forward. But it's actually a tweet that Sharif or Jeremy had tweeted while he was in Egypt. And I was following, Shireen and Ayman and other reporters, including Sharif, because once the internet went down, as he said, they had to find friends who could relay the tweets for them. But this was one that I found particularly, it just gave me a sense that I was there. So I'll end with this. It's, and Shakespeare, 140 characters, that's the whole vibe. Sun is setting, crowds huge in Tahrir, people have climbed all over tanks chanting, now they stop for a mass prayer, indescribable. And I think that's a testament to what the power of social media and independent journalism can do.
That's poetry. That's great. Okay, I want to thank the panelists. Now we're going to get to your questions. I'm going to ask them short, and we're going to get real short answers so we can go bang, 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 bang. What's being done to allow Al Jazeera English to be seen more widely in this country on cable? What should people in this room do, real fast?
Is this working? Okay,
Yes.
very quickly. First of all, feel free to talk to Sophia Qureshi, who's representing the PR team. She can give you more detailed advice. But it's worth mentioning that I really believe, and I think Al Jazeera believes, that change is best when it comes from within, whether we're talking about politics or anything else. So one thing we've done is we've created a website called demandaljazeera.net, where you can just go in, and it's extremely easy, and you just put in your zip code, and it automatically sends, and which cable provider you have, and it automatically sends a letter to your cable provider. And we've recently, I think, received 60,000 or something in that number, and we took them to Comcast because Comcast insisted that we stop sending them. They're one of the cable providers. So we actually boxed them, and the head of our news division went, and that's how we're participating. But I think the quick answer is that we're leaving it up to you to demand it.
And the website is demandaljazeera.com.
Yes, .net.
.net, I'm sorry, demandaljazeera.net. Okay. Real fast, maybe start with, go on.
Well, I'll get to it later.
Okay, yeah.
Essentially, I mean, you can access our live stream on Facebook, on YouTube. There's many platforms, and it's very easy to just take the embed code, and you can embed it either on your blog. And I think what's more important to mention in terms of how you can watch it is you can watch it currently on Dish TV as well as Direct TV. And I know that we're here to talk about independent journalism, but we have people like freespeech.org, which are broadcasting us, and other community accesses. So it's great. We're very encouraged by that, and that's why it's an honor, frankly, to be here.
And let's thank freespeech.org again. Okay. Let's pass the mic to Sharif and go real fast down the table. There's a series of questions that are similar. What is or should be the plan for the independent media to penetrate middle America to counteract, balance corporate networks, Fox News? Is there a way to use mainstream media to increase the awareness of independent news media outlets? Someone asked, how does each group get their money? I'd like you to real fast summary for each of your institutions. Are you growing? What are some reasons you're growing? Where are you getting your money?
Well, I joined Democracy Now! In 2003 at the start of the Iraq War. Back then, we were airing on about 112 stations. Right now, Democracy Now! Is airing on 950 stations. So I think there's no question that Democracy Now! Is continuing to grow. We continue to add stations every week, and I think it's because there's a hunger out there for real information, and the corporate news networks are just getting worse in their kind of soundbite and just highly visually produced journalism. So I think it's certainly growing.
One way I think that we can get attention to independent media to middle America better is to insist that mainstream media source the people who first broke the story. So if Al Jazeera tells a story first, we need to call up and tell NBC, you better give them credit for breaking that story, and that carries on to every level of, because at that point they're going to be embarrassed and they're going to start including, Al Jazeera on their cable channel. Fire Dog Lake is completely member support. Well, we have some ads, but they're not paying the bills. So we're primarily member supported. We're making a big effort right now to try and shore up that by doing kind of NPR type membership, because it's increasingly clear that even within the progressive community, the powers that be don't necessarily want us to be able to have long-term funding from institutional sources. So if you want to become a member of Fire Dog Lake, just go to the website and join.
And when you were live blogging, Marcy, from the Scooter Libby, Fire Dog Lake was getting quoted and mentioned in mainstream dailies. Am I correct?
They used me as the live stream. They used me as the equivalent of the AP for that trial, and some of them admitted it to me off the record. But only about 3 or 4 people actually were saying Fire Dog Lake is kind of the live stream coming out of the trial. And on fundraising for that one, all we did before we covered the trial was said we need $16,000 to pay for our apartment and for some flights to DC, and we raised it overnight. I told that to the general counsel from the Washington Post, and he almost cried to know how much less we had spent on what ended up being the definitive coverage of the trial compared to what they were spending being in D.C. So we do it on a shoestring,
Okay.
but we do use our money that we get from members and from supporters very cautiously.
Derek.
Well, I just want to second what you said about demanding mainstream media sourcing the people that they got the story from. Like the stories that I mentioned about Sanguine and Gardez, the mainstream media just kind of grabbed the great stuff that was done and then didn't source it, which was kind of terrible. But I also, this is going to sound very basic, but I want to encourage people, if you want to get independent media to penetrate your hometown and your circle of friends, to become active users of social media and not just follow people. For example, if you follow facebook.com/rethinkafghanistan, we're always posting stories and videos, but I think it's critical not just to get those in your news feed, but to also hit the share button so that the people inside your social networks see the same thing you're seeing, and it kind of breaks their silos because you're their friend, but they may not always agree with you politically, but they're going to see it when you share it. The same thing on Twitter, like twitter.com/afghanistan.docu. Don't just get those feeds, hit retweet so your friends that may not have like the same focus that you have on issues see the things coming out that you're seeing from shops like Rethink Afghanistan or Al Jazeera or Fire Dog Lake or Democracy Now! And it breaks their silo. The other thing is, I know it sounds basic, but you really have to support financially independent media because we don't attract major advertisers or things like that as our business model. Almost all of us rely totally on public support, and by public I mean your donations. So just make sure that you support us. So.
I'll just very quickly say two things. One, a lot of people have been saying recently, and it's really nice to finally hear, I'll be very frank, oh, Al Jazeera is amazing, oh, you guys, your coverage great, and it's great. But one thing I think that Hillary Clinton conveniently highlighted is I think the reason that everyone, or those people who haven't been familiar with Al Jazeera before are now watching Al Jazeera is not entirely, I should say, because Al Jazeera is doing things that no one has ever done before. I mean, I think we do offer a different perspective, and we do, our news is great, but it's more importantly that there's a real problem in this country, in terms of the mainstream media. And she said it, and it's on our website, you can go see it, it's our biggest endorsement, and it's great, and hopefully it'll help. But another thing I wanted to say is about the stream, because now I will shamelessly plug the show. But it's important because on your point, like the whole concept and the whole premise behind the stream is that it's really about independent journalism, or it's also about independent, for lack of a better word, activism, or independent anything. And the idea is that it's a talk show, and it's going to air starting on April 18th online, and then May 2nd it'll be on TV on Al Jazeera, for those of you who can access it. But what I wanted to say is that, it's really structured around the idea that everybody and anybody who has something interesting and relevant to say, and who's consistently, it's important that they're consistently participating in conversations online or wherever it might be in the independent journalism world, will be on the show, whether in the studio or on Skype. And I really mean it, like, any of you, and hopefully, I'd love to have some of the panelists on the show as well. But the idea is that Joe Schmo or Ahmed Mohammed or whatever could be on the show, and so that's what we're really trying to do. And I really would invite you all to please, especially at the very early stages, please help us and inform us on what so that we can do what we're trying to do better. So thank you. It's called The Stream, and so you get stream.aljazeera.com, and yes, that's .com, not .net.
Okay, we have 10 minutes. I'm going to be in the stream. I'm going to bring my towel and bathing suit. Ahmed mentioned that in the Arab countries, the overwhelming majority of people are under 29. These are questions from and about young people. Does the panel have any advice for young independent journalists interested in reporting on international conflicts? And another, do you see your work with Democracy Now! And as a journalist, this is for the whole panel, as journalist as a form of activism and social justice work? In your opinion, can journalism be a form of social activism, or does that compromise, quote, objectivity, unquote? That's from a University of Minnesota student and citizen journalist. Who wants to start?
I'm going to answer the last question about objectivity because I have a PhD in this subject secretly. This notion of objectivity that journalists in this country like to talk about is very limited historically and geographically to the United States. It doesn't exist in most of the rest of the world. And in most of the rest of the world, their press is better than what we have today. The reason we have quote-unquote objectivity in this country is twofold. One is because it was a means to make money. They invented it because you could sell it to anybody. And the second one is because the elite who rely on scraps from the powers that be, like this he said, she said, let's cover it as a horse race rather than what's really going on. So if you're a student, you need to be cautious about endorsing this because you won't necessarily get a job if you go out and start a blog that's very outspoken. And I mean that very seriously, because if you're applying for a job, they're going to look and see what you've done, and when they find that you've endorsed somebody politically, they won't hire you. However, it's important to realize that what you're being taught in your program is very limited to the United States, and it's an increasingly corrupt system.
I think that's great. One thing I would just to shore that up is if you're wanting to do your own independent journalism and you have a social activist bent, like just to reinforce what you said, you don't want to try to be he said, she said. You want to be honest and fair. And that's what reporting should be focused on rather than just taking two sides who disagree and reporting what they say. Now, as far as the question of your objectivity and how that compromises you, be upfront. If you have a perspective, make sure that's well stated. For example, this is kind of a failure of military intelligence. I was once mentioned in a military report for my blogging on the Afghanistan war under the column objective and fair, and I laughed pretty hard about that because that made me kind of think they weren't actually reading what I was writing, because I wasn't very nice to the military most of the time because of what was going on in Afghanistan. But I stated my position up front. I made sure if someone disagreed with me, if I represented their arguments, I didn't mischaracterize them on purpose to make it more convenient, and tried to engage in debate. And that, I think, is what a good faith journalist should do and should replace this kind of outmoded idea we have of like you can be objective by just letting General Petraeus, who's got millions of dollars behind his PR shop, say whatever he wants, and then let somebody who disagrees with them say something for 15 seconds, and that's objective. So.
Ahmed.
I love this question, and the reason I love it is because this has been something I've battled with at the beginning when I first started and entered the field of journalism. In fact, I quit my job, or I left my job at the New York Times, partly because I was watching things like Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera thinking, why am I not doing that? Whatever that might be, I'll leave it at that. But one thing I quickly wanted to say on the issue of objectivity is, even though this reflects my views, I think it's important to say this. In Time magazine, or in Time.com, the head of Washington bureau chief of Al Jazeera was asked the question, sorry, forgive me, about Al Jazeera's point of view and how that fits into what Time referred to as the US idea of journalistic objectivity. I'll only read half of the answer. It'll take 12 seconds, I hope, maybe 22. To be honest, I don't know what objective journalism means. The environment in which you broadcast obviously colors your coverage. If you are an American network broadcasting from the US, you will be broadcasting with a sensibility which may not look necessarily objective to an audience in another part of the world. And the same is true if you're a network like Al Jazeera Arabic broadcasting out of the Middle East. But we have to go beyond that, Bob. And then I'll leave it to the last sentence, which is we cannot live in a world where a story like Egypt, which has consequences for the whole world, is unfolding and your audience doesn't know anything about it or enough about it.
What has objectivity become, we've learned from people, this current staff at FAIR, is in US mainstream media, you place yourself in between the elites of the two political parties and you call that objectivity. So if on issue after issue the Democrats are proposing solutions that can't possibly solve the problem, whether it's health care, the ridiculous cap and trades on global warming, or even the weak net neutrality, and the other side, the Republicans, have no solutions at all. What is objectivity? It's a spectrum that goes from solutions that can't possibly solve a problem to no solutions at all. And that's what we're fed night after night, and that's what those two are fighting over. That's objectivity. All right, I want to announce something. There's an important panel today at 4 led by Sam Husseini in Cambridge #1, and it leads to a question we got from the audience. The panel is, can independent media be asking tough questions of politicians? What are the prospects of getting more independent journalists into news conferences? Imagine if serious independent journalists were in the White House newsroom asking tough questions during the buildup of the Iraq War, not just the White House, State Department, Pentagon, Justice Department, etc. That's 4 o'clock today in the Cambridge 1 room. And Assad Badruddin wrote, how important is it, and this will be our last question, how important is it for bloggers and aggregators of information in the U.S. to have been to the places they cover?
Ask Andy Carvin. I mean, honestly, I don't think it would be great to go. I think obviously there's advantages, and I'm sure Sharif can talk more with Egypt as an example, perhaps, or others who've gone. But I mean, part of the whole reason our show hopefully will be somewhat successful is that, you know, you don't have to be in the place with the technologies that we have and with the availability, you know, of those technologies, even in parts of the world where maybe internet penetration is quite low. I mean, internet penetration in Egypt, I think, was something like 18%. So anyway, I'll let the rest of the panelists answer.
Anyone else?
I mean, I certainly don't think aggregators or bloggers have to be where they are, but their primary source of information relies on people who are there. And so we can't forget that reporters on the ground are where everything starts. And so to the extent that people can report from the ground, they should. And you can tweet and blog and do whatever from there. Aggregators, I think, and bloggers are extremely important. I rely on them very heavily. And they also provide analysis of the news. But for the news gathering itself, you have to have the person there.
Forgive me, if I can quickly add, I just realized I have a better answer. One thing that we're trying to do, and one thing that technology is kind of, there's a limitation, is it's really hard to find out where tweets are coming from. It's really hard to find out where even, not blogs, but specifically tweets, Facebook posts even. Geolocation, the technology is not really as sophisticated as perhaps we'd like. Because if I could guarantee that when someone inputs in their profile that they're actually in Libya or they're actually in Tunisia or Sidi Bouzid or whatever, it would be really helpful, and that's not always the case on Twitter, which is somewhat unfortunate. I think, though, it's evolving, and I would imagine that would be helpful because it is obviously important to be speaking to people on the ground.
Okay, I want to thank our panel. Sharif Abdel Kouddous from Democracy Now! Marcy Wheeler of Fire Dog Lake. Derek Crow, Brave New Foundation. Ahmed Shihab-Eldin from The Stream and Al Jazeera. Thank you all.